right. Welcome back, friends. The BGE team has two very special guests today. Please welcome Sandy O'Sullivan and Hannah Reardon-Smith. Sandy is a professor of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University, and Hannah is a postdoctoral research associate. Thanks for hanging out with us today.
Thanks for having us.
All right. So, Sandy, first question's for you. So, what was your scholastic journey to become a professor of Indigenous Studies?
Well, I left school when I was 13, which was in the 1970s. And I went back into education, having been a musician for a long time, and in the 80s. And then I became an academic 31 years ago. So I started working in that way as an Aboriginal person. There weren't a lot of Indigenous people at the time who were in the academy. It was pretty usual for us to be leaving school very young. And so there just weren't a lot of people who were there to kind of model what it was to be doing the work that we now do in the Indigenous studies area. But I came out of doing creative practice work, and I came out of doing work across critical race areas and found my way towards both gender studies and Indigenous studies. And at our particular area at Macquarie, we actually do both. So we have a very centred approach to say that queer indigeneity is at the centre of complexity of who we are as Indigenous people. And so I guess that's the very, very rough rundown of it. But obviously 31 years is a really long time, so I won't bore you with all of the stuff that I did in the interim. But I think it's not an uncommon journey to have been across a lot of disciplines. Indigenous studies is every discipline. Of course it is, because we're across every area. So, it makes sense.
That's great. Sorry. Hannah, similar question. What led you to pursue a PhD in music and now postgraduate research?
I'll preface just by saying that I'm not Indigenous. I'm a white settler scholar.
Hi, Kaitlynn.
By Kaitlynn. We've lost Kaitlynn. And I'm, living and working on Yagara and Turrbal country in what the settler colonial nation state knows as Queensland in Meanjin, Brisbane. Which is not where Macquarie is, I should say. Macquarie is on Darug country, which is further south near Sydney. I'm a musician. I've been a musician primarily throughout my adult life and done a lot of music study and playing, and I play the flute and I do things with electronics. I compose, I improvise, and my doctoral research was kind of pursuing, in a way, I think for a lot of artistic researchers, there's a kind of point that you're really trying to articulate your own practice and your own identity within your artistic practice. And so I think a lot of my PhD was really carving out that space and kind of moving away from the training that I'd had in within academic institutions, particularly from a European art music background. And I've also, alongside my music studies, I was always involved as a community organizer, an activist, an anti-colonial solidarity activist, and a queer activist. And I was also being able to really step into my queer identity in many ways. It was always there and underwrote everything that I did. But I grew up in, a more conservative town, and it was always a bit too much of a people pleaser, and let that rule my identity for far too long. And there was this kind of parallel between stepping into my queer identity and stepping into the artistic practice that I feel is most myself now. And so a lot of that was involved in pursuing that PhD. And so my doctoral study was kind of like a queer feminist thinking of freely improvised music. And to do that, I really wanted to think with what it meant to claim freedom in music on like stolen land in a settler colonial context as a white musician. And that, it led me into reading much deeper into a lot of things, and to also engage with a lot of queer Indigenous thinkers, including Prof. O'Sullivan, and also many others, particularly Alison Whitaker, and also Yorta Yorta song woman Deb, and several others that really shaped my thinking and where I went from there. And I got to meet Prof. O'Sullivan at a conference and really got to know a bit of their work. And the more that I read of their writing and of what they're doing, the more that I really felt into how much I wanted to kind of like go down this track of looking deeper into the artistic work of queer Indigenous people, and got to know the department that Prof is part of and now I'm part of, and just so many incredible people really thinking from this like central point of queer Indigenous people. And so I then stepped from doing a lot of artistic thinking and artistic research into an Indigenous Studies department, and to really thinking with queer indigeneity and learning so much from that. So that's how I got where I am.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, we met at a music and gender conference that I was doing a keynote for, I think, a few years ago, and so it made sense. Then when I saw that you'd applied for the job, I thought, well, we'd had that conversation, so yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of it's often how it works. We've got a new PhD who's working with us, Leandro Wallace, who's one of the people from the Engender podcast, who's just come over from Argentina. So just joined us from Argentina. It was the same thing.
Wow.
We'd engaged with them, kind of, then they'd applied, and it was, well, we know the wonderful work that Leandro's already doing. So
right. That's awesome. That you find community that way. Like community always provides, I feel like.
Community always provides. And I think anti-colonial work is always about relationships. It's always about finding one another. And it's important work for us to be doing. And absolutely. Obviously, working with settlers like Hannah is incredibly important for Indigenous people, because we're strengthened by working with people who are genuinely here and wanting to challenge that coloniality. And it's no mean feat to find people who are genuine around that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sandy, you're currently an Australian Research Council Future Fellow.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little more about the fellowship program and your current project?
Yeah, it's one of those senior fellowships that, it means that I got $1 million off the government to fund some work for 4 years that looked at the capacity for queer Indigenous people to affect change across the community. So the project's called Saving Lives, mapping the influence of queer Indigenous artists. But it's really looking at people who are making. And out of that, it's funny, these programs are all about the individual. So they're about the fellow, basically, but there's a team of people that I work with, including Hannah. So Hannah's the postdoc on the team. And then we have some other students, including Leandro, who's doing their PhD, but also a couple of people who are working on the Queer As audit, which was actually how we came to know this podcast.
Really?
My complete addiction to it. So I think I've seen almost everything. And of course, what's powerful about it, I'll come back to that, but just to finish it in terms of the program, look, there is incredible power in representation. And the way that people are making and being able to make across a range of artistic fields, and the way that they're doing it in spite of the colony is incredible. We know that what happens for a lot of queer Indigenous kids is that they can feel isolated. And all queer kids can, but for Indigenous kids, there's the kind of extra layer of coloniality that's brought religion and a whole lot of misunderstandings, not necessarily from within the community, but from outside of it, that tend to make us smaller, tend to make us not so prominent in that way. So there's a number of bits of work that we do as a part of this. And the Queer as audit is looking at queer representation, but it's really looking at it in the context of serial screen work for a very particular reason that I'll pop back to. But the other work that we're doing is to work on this project called Storied, which is it's framed as a curated creative imaginings from queer Indigenous artists, but it's actually them talking about their connection to representation and their connection to meaning making in their work, and all sorts of artists, from visual artists through to musicians. Obviously, Hannah and I both have a background in music, and so, but also in making other forms of art and in doing anti-colonial work, you're often drawing on multiples. And in the same way as Indigenous studies is across a range of disciplines, a lot of queer Indigenous artists work across more than one discipline. And this is true for queer artists in general, but it's specifically true for queer Indigenous artists because it's true for Indigenous artists. And it's for a range of reasons, but it's mostly that siloing, that kind of having to put things into boxes is the colonial project, is to say if you're an actor, you're just an actor. You don't get to be a musician as well. Or maybe you do, but then it's going to be a list of things that you do, but it's going to be these silos. And so we're seeing people breaking that down a bit. But yeah, it was, there's this other work too that's looking at challenging the notion of session. So this idea of a session, this idea of an agreement that was never there, to suggest that Indigenous people would be forced into colonial containers, including gender. So I do a lot of work on the colonial project of gender for that reason, and also because I'm trans. So it's part of the journey for me, I suppose, as an individual, but it's part of many people's journeys. And and creative expression is a great way to be able to talk to other people from, for instance, my generation. I'm in my late 50s. People who are younger, who are wanting to communicate with their family. We're working on a major project with Parents of Gender Diverse Children, which is a national organisation that looks at how to provide support, and we're doing a project that develops up resources. But going back to the queer as, which we only worked out recently, sounds a bit like queer ass. We don't say it that way, we say ass. So of course,
the best kind of ass.
Yeah. The only kind we love.
Yeah, I mean, totally queer ass, and queer ass. So it's really looking at the complexity of queer representation. So it's looking at queer representation, but it's saying how complex can queerness be in this kind of serialized form, sort of conservative form of TV, where there's actually a large group of people who are not necessarily queer working on something where we expect to see queer characters represented. And so it's trying to understand that, and it's doing a lot of different work in that. And so we've been working with a bunch of people, but particularly with Alana Blakers and Taya Miller are two of our students who are doing an internship with us at the moment to help us build this audit, where we're just basically auditing, but not like a queer version of the Internet Movie Database. It's a bit more than that. It's trying to understand where there are relationships to power in particular ways, but also to representation. So obvious stuff like looking at queer baiting or queer coding or any of that. In something like the Internet Movie Database, you could have something that has a list of queer characters, but it's not going to centre on that idea of queerness. And again, we do a whole centering on Indigenous queerness within that space, but then we move out from there and say, well, what other complexities are there? What other ways can people be represented in that complexity? Because oftentimes we know, and you've said so many times across this podcast that there'll be a selection of one thing. So people will pick queerness, or they'll pick indigeneity, or they'll pick race they'll pick disability, they'll pick something, but they won't understand that actually there's a lot of people who are the complexity of a lived experience is that you're often lots of those things, and that is not often what's being represented in this kind of front-facing serial TV programs. So we're looking at TV. We're also looking at the serialization of some films. So we've got a bit of a focus on Marvel. And looking at the queer and lack of queer characters, and also the kind of way that the queerness in Marvel in particular becomes a kind of dumping space for, yes, we've got a queer character there, and I guess in light of that, it'll be interesting to see how Echo works, because it'll have queer Indigenous characters in it. But will that become no, we did it, it was over there, remember, so we don't have to do it again. So, and we came to, sorry, not we, I came to listening to this podcast because, it was just remarkable, to hear people talking for hours about, it is, it's remarkable to have that sort of time. It matters that you're all, very eloquent and great at analysis, of course, but that's, in its own way, that's, I'm not sure that you'd get those hours out of it otherwise, but it's remarkable to have that sort of time with the content, and that's what we're doing, I guess, as well with the Career Hours Archive, is trying to spend time with some of the content and trying to think about those moments that come out of it that are more than just seeing this in a kind of serial way, or seeing one show and another show and another show and hoping for queer representation. Sorry, it was a million things to say.
No,
and maybe
it was
thinking
an
about
answer, and thank you.
And maybe we're thinking about what, not just like what that representation is, and like a dot point of the different layers of complexity of an individual's identity, but also thinking in detail about the work that's doing, like what work that's doing for an audience, what work that's doing for people that have maybe that particular kind of wheelhouse of identity complexity, but but also like how that's kind of inserted into the story, how that characterization, or in the case of like queer baiting and things, like what role that's playing. And then looking a little bit also at, and this is another point that this podcast comes in, like the kind of fan feedback, or the way that viewers can kind of take stories in their own directions and like articulate what it is that they wish they were seeing that they're not seeing, and kind of looking at how that kind of interactive, rather than it just being like, this is what's blasted out into the world. It's like, it's looking at how that actually has a kind of interactive element that, the kind of like little Easter eggs, or the little hat tipping that writers and producers do to an audience that has complex analysis, that has complex engagement with queer characters on screen. So yeah, that's another way that it's kind of going that step further than just like listing. Yeah.
Including when it's shitty, and
absolutely.
I think probably especially when it is, obviously the idea isn't just to bash these sites that are trying to do something, but it's also how much work is involved to, for instance, queerbait. It's a lot of work, but there's also a really interesting thing that happens often for Indigenous characters that are in otherwise mainstream, or what we might call white stream shows. And that's that there is this, they're often already having to do some work. And so that idea of getting them to do a little more work. But there's also that problem of, how do you know a character is queer if they don't have a relationship or talk about it? So, and we just had ACE Week, which has been really interesting in terms of looking for, queer, for ACE characters in particular. And of course, where they're present is in a lot of animated series, for a range of reasons. But some of those reasons are, they're often not analysed. So the idea of asexuality as this kind of absence is often how it gets framed in, in, for instance, a series. And the problem with series, and the reason that we're interested in series rather than just one-off screen rep, is that you have time with the characters. You have time for them to develop, and you have time to see the potential. And of course, one of the things that happens in writers' rooms is that they decide for characters to have relationships. And so characters that might otherwise, for instance, be Ace, aren't, or Arrow, or, or any other representation that, isn't necessarily that well understood. And it's not like there's none. And in fact, there are some, and that's part of what we're also, flagging, is that this isn't. This is also about locating people. So it's not just about problematizing how people are being included or characters are being written. But actually, sorry, if I can just add, I come back to, there's an amazing interview that you did with Olivia Lucas, and in that there's a couple of incredibly important moments for us in this work. One's the representation, as she frames it, of Afro-Indigenous people, and that the only reason that the character was written that way was because there was someone in the writer's room who wanted it. That's incredibly powerful, and we know it. I did this work for donkey's years that was about looking at representation in museums and galleries, and looking at how Indigenous people are represented in those spaces. And it's no surprise that it happened where there were Indigenous curators most effectively and in a more complex way. You're going to get that complexity, because why not? But the answer is often because we want to make it as open as possible. But open as possible usually defaults to white. So it's about understanding some of those challenges, and it often defaults to cis het as well. So.
That's awesome. That was such an amazing interview for us, and we ended up talking with her for hours after we stopped recording. So she was just one of the I think it was probably, no offense to anyone else, my favorite interview. So totally loved it.
Learned a lot during it.
We learned a lot, and that's why it was my favorite interview. Because
there's a line in there where she says, and I'll just read it off the page, talking about Thelma being queer, where she says, also for Indigenous people, it's so normal. And hearing that, not only is it a great line that will be used again and again by us, but it's so powerful and it's so true, because the rhetoric is often here for decades. Here it was, Indigenous people don't like queerness, and they don't do queer. I mean, this was what was said about us. But meantime, we're just there being queer people. And actually, it's just not true. Like, even with the power of the church, there is a negotiation that is not necessarily really understood more broadly, and it's part of what happens in the colony, in the resistant colony, is that you still support your own in that resistance, and so it isn't that big a deal. So, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yes, thank you. It seems like that now is a great time for this project, and we're excited to see what comes out of this, because it's a fascinating thing to really dive into. So thanks for sharing that. Hannah, question for you. So you are a producer and presenter for Radio Reversal. Can you tell us a little bit about what Radio Reversal is and how you got involved with it?
Yeah. Radio Reversal is a show on a community radio station here in Meanjin called 4ZZZ. And it's community run. It's it's kind of got a like punk DIY kind of aesthetic, and has a very strong focus on profiling local musicians, local artists. And Radio Reversal is a show that's been running now for a bit over 10 years, which is wild. I haven't been involved for that long, but it's, we just had kind of our 10-year anniversary, which is, it was a really special episode. But it's a co-produced thing. It's really a community project. So there's about 6 of us that are really regular presenter producers. Some of us a little bit more regular than others. There's sort of 3 main people and then there's like some very regular guests. But then it's essentially like based in kind of critical theory, community organizing, and anti-colonial like solidarity efforts. Run by a group of queer people and largely queer women that are really thinking with as many thinking with the kind of like work that we're also doing through a community organizing outfit called the Brisbane Free University, which is definitely started as kind of like a public lecture series. At the moment, the most common thing we do is a reading group. So it's the BFU Radical Reading Group. So my involvement, I guess, in Radio Reversal came through the reading group and through the public lectures and going along to these things. And having been, Prof talks about like these siloed sort of things, particularly in the art world, studying music, particularly studying at a conservatorium like I did, which in the case of the one where I studied, the Queensland Conservatorium, is like literally its own building away from the rest of the campus of the university that it's associated with. So extremely siloed, extremely kind of like enclosed space. And you're like studying this one kind of art making in this particular way. And you don't have a lot of contact with other thinkings or other kinds of ways of engaging with the world and ways of engaging with knowledge and like who gets to have knowledge and the kind of politics of knowledge. So I think I was always like just a bit outspoken and resisting that in many ways. And I sort of tried to do some like cross-institutional stuff that didn't really pan out the way I was hoping. And so through more activist circles, found my way into BFU, Brisbane Free Uni, and became extremely good friends with a lot of people and started like organizing and doing things with them. So it's kind of the idea is to like remove this like enclosure of like knowledge or thinking from this institutionalized space, and to make it really open. So the reading group's really open. There's absolutely no prerequisite to like have a certain level of like understanding of critical theory or things like this. The idea is that anyone can engage with these texts. And even if you haven't read the text, or often we have a podcast or a screening or something like that, with like there's still openness to be involved in the discussion and to talk about like the understanding that you drew from it and like, or the understanding that you're drawing from the conversation that's happening. So it's a really open space, and we make sure that all of our texts are as accessible as we can make them with the limited resources. So it's always presented as a written text and with an audio recording, so then the Radio Reversal is, I guess, a little like public injection on the airwaves. And so it's a good opportunity to be talking with people, like interviewing people and having conversations like this. We have an hour a week, and we also play some music and things. So it's often, quick conversations. Everything's edited down a little bit, but we're hoping to also branch out into some more frequent. We've done a few kind of like podcast releases, but we're hoping to kind of make we sort of have these series sometimes where we are like really thinking with a particular topic. So recently there's been a lot of thinking. One of my co-producers, presenters, Marissa, she's a new mum for the second time, so she's been thinking a lot with measurement and like essentially the colonial project of measurement, and how this is used to like as a system of control. And when you're like a new parent, the constant weighing of your child and all of these like milestones that you're going through as like supposed to meet this by this point and this by this point, and the anxiety that produces for an individual. And so there's been some thinking with that, and then so that's radio reversal. So but just recently I had a good conversation with an amazing Quandamooka Aboriginal and African American artist Sachem on a show that we did on Friday, which was a really brilliant performance, but also just to talk about, you know, the developing, he's this like really young and really great artist. I only really realized he's like 22, and I was like, oh, whoa, okay, yeah, cool. Yeah, I've done things. I'm 35. But yeah, just.
We're all really young.
But yeah,
Good
just hearing his thinking with community and in community, and how that comes through in his music and his poetry. It was such a beautiful conversation. And then like the performance was also really beautiful. So, you know, it's a wide variety. So I do a little bit of talking with people as a kind of like radical musicers of Meanjin thing, because I'm the resident musician for the show. So yeah, that's a bit of a haphazard summary of radio reversal and the community around it.
And it's a community radio station that's really successful in what is a pretty big city. I think there's 3 million people in Brisbane, so it's got some size, and you know there is a real sense of it as a community site. So
that's so cool. We talked a little bit that you knew of us, and that's how we got to know you. But we're curious about what drew you to Motherland, Fort Salem, and our podcast family.
Oh, actually, I think it might be a slight secret. I know somebody who works on it, so that was what drew me to watching it. And then, look, one of the things that I've been trying to do is to look at, I think Motherland in particular, it's a kind of pretty, it's great, but it's also a very straightforward show in a lot of ways. You know, it's, I think you've posited that it's surprising that there isn't a greater audience for it. And in fact, I feel the same way, because it seems like the sort of highly accessible show that would have, a much bigger fan base than it seemed to accrue. And obviously there are lots of reasons for that. But what attracted me to finding you was actually I'd been looking at reactors. I'd worked with a reactor who'd been able to go to Klexicon in 2019 for the beginning of this Queer As work, and they'd gone there. Emily Papak had gone there and done a really great review for us, which was the starting point to me starting to work on this. And at the time, there was the big discussion, stoush, around trans people and inclusion in Klexicon. And so I got firsthand kind of knowledge of that. I just couldn't get over there that year. And in fact, we had a couple of our colleagues go to this year's Klexicon and have reported back as well. And at the time, and even now, there are almost no Indigenous queer representation. There was one panel that was content creators. You know, it was on YouTube. You know, it was not necessarily the kind of representation that we're looking at, which is largely this kind of fictional character representation. But also, it's not surprising that there aren't. Actually, one of the places where a lot of queer Indigenous representation is happening is on this continent. So we've got a lot. I mean, you can see it in Heartbreak High, for instance, but you can see it more broadly across everything from Clever Man through to a lot of things that you probably don't have access to that are from so-called Australia. And what's been interesting then in looking at spaces like the reactors is to see what sparks their interest. And that's why I've been looking at them, is to understand what your average person is looking at and what they're seeing. And the whole framing of reactors is that they're your average person. The whole framing of it is that they're just you're not your average person. You're people who have a great level of complexity. No disrespect to reactors, but they don't necessarily have the kind of in-depth knowledge that you represent. So I started listening actually because some of them are like 3 hours.
They sure are.
And
I tried to get them to shorten it when I first started, and then I realized, no, that's just them. We're gonna keep going with
we
it.
can't. You should see our outlines.
Look, it's brilliant. I feel like I have seen your outlines. I've seen them played out. And what's brilliant about it is not just, again, the cleverness and the time with it, but also it's covering a lot of ground that we'd identified was really needed when we were looking at queer as. It's not just about, is that a bit of queer baiting? It's actually understanding what's happening with characters and what happens with audiences, what they expect, and what's possible. And of course, what you've done is suggested things that are possible, and suggested things that are available as a set of ideas that is like a layer on top of the actual work. So it makes it better. So I think at one stage it would have been any show, but I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think I watched 3 mostly so that I could keep up with where you were at with it. So I became in that, and I think again, I can't believe everybody isn't listening to you who's interested in this, and people may not find the time to be able to do that, but it is powerful, and powerful too in terms of interviews. Again, I mean, the Lucas interview was really interesting. There was stuff drawn out of there that we wouldn't have been able to find otherwise. And I know because then after that, we went to try and find everything that was available, and it wasn't there in these other forms. So giving time over, but also having that kind of allowing for that complex discussion, it was incredibly important. Yeah.
Thank you. That was why we started. That was like the goal. Pretty much everything you said is because Theora had listened to podcasts before that were that length, and she really enjoyed the in-depth analysis and everything. And so we wanted to bring that, but also some of our weird humor. So you got.
The humor is incredibly important too, because if you don't have that, I mean, what the fuck are you doing? It has to be an essential part of it, because there's also humor in what's not being realized, in what you aren't seeing, the behind the scenes of a character. I mean, and that there's got to be humor in all of that, and I think especially in a show that isn't focused on humor. I don't mean there's no humor in it, but I think it works even more in that instance.
I mean, we're very real about the fact that Motherland would be very depressing if you just looked at it from straight on. So you're incredibly right.
I think you've got one episode that look, I'm not going to be able to remember which one it was, but I think it's like season 2, episode 4, that's really depressing, and you kind of set it out with it's depressing, and it's really interesting because I listened to it and hadn't rewatched it since I'd seen it the year before or whatever, and went back and watched it, and I thought, oh my god, it really is depressing. And it was interesting to kind of hear how you played that out, though, and I think really powerful.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
That
means a lot to hear.
In my culture, in Wiradjuri culture, we have this expression, Yinamara Wanagana, and it's to live well in a world that you've made good. So you make a world that's good, and then you live well in it. But you have to make the world that's good. And I think again, sometimes when you hear reactors, it's great, but it's like a response and you don't really know anything about their contexts. And this whole notion of kind of making a world in which Motherland or any other series enriches your life is incredibly powerful in these podcasts. And I think we all have to do that work.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. That's
the first time I heard this podcast, I was like, oh, wow, they're really smart.
Yeah.
And I just come in and I bring in chaos.
No,
Chaos
you
is
bring a
good.
lot more than chaos.
I'm sure you do, but chaos isn't a bad thing either.
No, it's
No,
not.
and chaos is
that,
definitely,
I think that
part of,
we
unpacking the complexity of things. Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
the anti-colonial work we do is chaos. So
I'm sure.
I'm sure. I think you have to throw that. You have to have that component for things to get shaken up. Otherwise, it's just going to remain the same. So change doesn't come without chaos.
Yeah. Hard agree.
So we have a question for both of you, and that is, how does media representation, or lack thereof, impact intersectional communities such as queer Indigenous groups? It's a big question.
Yeah, it is a big question. And, the project's called Saving Lives. Our overarching project is called Saving Lives. And it's called that for a reason. I was really pleased that the government put $1 million into this. Our uni put another $1 million into it, which I think is like 1.5 million or something in US dollars. So it's a lot of money, but it's also, what it is it's an investment in the trust that we might be able to do some work that changes people's outcomes, makes them feel seen, and also so that they can see how they can be in the world. And I think that issue of representation is even more crucial for some groups. And it's not just queer Indigenous people, because that's a monolith too. There's older people, there's younger people, there's all variety of people, as many as there are people. And that idea of challenging symbolic annihilation is incredibly important when we've been subject to actual annihilation. The colony has been about trying to demolish us. I was born a year before we gained rights as Indigenous people. There's a very solid argument that that we weren't considered people at all before then. In fact, we weren't subjects, and we were, at least in some ways, part of the Flora and Fauna Act. So the fauna part of it, but we were not considered to have rights. My mother was born in another country and came over to this country and had rights as an immigrant that her children didn't have. And and this is a really, this is in just my lifetime. So I'm in my late 50s, but still only in my lifetime that happened. And we're still dealing with the after effects of that involves people not really asking, requiring, or getting representation. And so it's often just one or two really good actors in the space, people who are doing the work, that change that. And we've had that here in TV and film. We've had a lot of Indigenous people who've been making, but we've had a few people like Sally Riley who put together Clever Man, who pitched a lot of Indigenous representation, a Wiradjuri person, so from the same community as me. We've got over 300 different communities in Australia. And, so we have this person who's responsible for probably 20 to 30% of queer Indigenous representation. And particularly probably much more than that in terms of Indigenous representation, and why does it happen? Well, it happens when people are queer and Indigenous. It happens when you've got people who are there in the decision making, and that's been only in the last 20, 25 years. And so we're starting to see it more, but it takes that participation. It takes someone not just wanting to show representation, but knowing what it means and knowing how it affects people's lives. And so we called it Saving Lives for a couple of reasons. Sorry, I think that was the royal we. I called it Saving Lives for a couple of reasons. One was because we have the highest suicide rates in the world, queer Indigenous people. So it's that. And a lot of that is about knowing who we are in the world and knowing that that we will be accepted in the broader community, and sometimes within our own community because of these other issues. But look, the other reason is the idea of remembering the groundbreaking work that people are doing is incredibly important. I remember a few years ago thinking, I grew up in the 70s, there wasn't that much queer representation on TV in the 70s. It's not true. There was actually a lot. And people like Matt Bauer, who does this remarkable work on looking at representation. I would think about something like Mary Tyler Moore Show, and I think, well, there's no queer characters on there. There were. I just didn't remember them and see them. And that's how symbolic annihilation works. You don't look for things, you remember things as absent. You kind of erase yourself from these scenarios. And I've never seen, up until I think 8 or 9 years ago was the first time I saw Aboriginal people kissing on screen. Yeah. Whenever Brand New Day came out, was that 8 or 9 years ago? It was the first time. I can't believe that.
That's insane.
And I'm talking about heterosexuals, and when we think about queer representation in that way, it's off the charts problematic. And yet the last couple of years, we've seen massive changes in that representation that are wonderful. But they can't just be lip service, so the power of it is it saves lives. The power of it is not the extreme. It's not the extreme horror of us losing people, kids mostly in our communities. It's also this idea that people don't believe that they belong, and they find all sorts of ways to not participate in their own life because of that, or to change who they are, which doesn't usually end well. So I think the power is in that, and anti-colonial work has to be about calling that out. And it has to be about also pointing out good stuff that's happening. It's this positive charging of saying, when you do have complex queer representation, call it out and show it and say, look, see how easy this was to do, or see how hard this was to do, but see how easy it is to consume. And really recognizing that. And again, I think it's incredibly difficult for characters where they're in the middle of a war, and you're not going to find out that they're queer because it's not part of the arc of a character. But there are flags and strategies, sometimes literal flags, and strategies to talk about queerness, and they're available. And so again, we hope that an audit reminds people of that availability, even if it's just cheating and sneaky. Who cares? Representation is representation, as well as we want it to be more complex.
All right. So again, free for all kind of question. So we talked a little bit about how the representation in media has definitely evolved over time. And so we're just curious, what are your thoughts on the current kind of landscape of what representation looks like now, like quantity and quality in media today?
Sorry, Han, go.
No. I'll just kind of throw a bit of where, part of it is the inability to watch everything and be able to give a comprehensive answer, and that's partly why we have the amazing assistance of a couple of Gen Zers, Alana and Taya, who are doing such great work. Not only watching a lot of the stuff that we don't always have time to watch, but also really thinking about it and thinking with it, and unpacking a lot of this complexity. I guess we're really thinking about like the kind of the gains that are being made and the like the ways that they're, are kind of representations that, we wouldn't have seen before. And I think that's like particularly, it's very intentionally evident in remakes of shows. And so like Heartbreak High here, just because I know that's a show from this place that is also available to watch in Turtle Island in the US. And that's a very different thing to the Heartbreak High that was on the small screen in the 90s that I watched growing up. It's a very it's intentionally kind of sitting with identity complexities in ways that are meaningfully more aware of some of the political positioning than at that time. But and
but it's still got some of the problematic stuff about it too.
It's exactly, and that's kind of the thing is that.
Sorry, Hannah. I was just going to say it's still doing that. It's still doing that problematic stuff of the schoolyard as this kind of imagined unsafe place. That swap out for a prisoner or Wentworth is really interesting. So
and that's the thing is that it's sort of like
different.
There's this kind of like claim to or like really trying to make really like articulated in many cases this is this identity and this is this identity, and it's once again kind of a little bit contained, a little bit siloed. So like, and you're a representation of this and you're a representation of this, and therefore we are diverse. And then when it reproduces some of these like some of these same kind of tropes and storylines that you have to question, like, is this like net good, or is this like doing further harm just because you've like named this particular
like
kind
everyone,
of complex.
Sorry, everyone on Heartbreak High is skinny. Everyone on Heartbreak High is skinny, so that they've got this kind of notion of, I mean, I don't know if they've met other Aboriginal people that they haven't cast in that, but I'm telling you, we're not skinny. So, but also, it's about broader representation in that way. I think on Turtle Island, A League of Their Own is a really good example of that. And that's got, I think we count down 13 kind of characters that have that are queer, that have a real profile on the show. And 13 is a lot. Like, it's remarkable. Yeah. What happens when you have 13 is that you can have some baddies. You can have goodies. You can have people who are like morally ambiguous. You can do that stuff. You can't do that when you've got 2 or 3. And we're really interested in that idea of how, especially queer Indigenous characters, are always coded as kind of the hero, or not so much the villain. I mean, never the villain, actually, but always the hero or the sad character, so somebody who's suffered from colonization. When that doesn't happen is when, like, queer, like something like Rutherford Falls, for instance, or Res Dogs, for instance, like you see some more complexity where you can have like the baddies and you can have the goodies and you can have the way that they interact with one another. But I'm also really interested, Hannah, I just totally took over what you were saying then. Was that okay?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Look, I was just going to say about, one of the things that we've had to be really careful of is this issue of queer actors within this space, because there are a lot of queer actors that are not talking about being queer. And in particular, that's, it's a concern for us because, the sort of calling out. I mean, I can't believe I'm kind of saying this in 2022, but here we are, in a space where for people to identify themselves as queer, particularly when they're playing smaller roles in smaller productions, can actually isolate, their capacity. And so we've been really cautious about how we write about the idea of kind of excluding queerness. And I've had a really funny experience of having, can I tell the story of this? And you know what the story is, Hannah. Look, I had, I'd written something about 4 years ago now, about 4 years ago, I'd written about 4 characters that were queer, either queer characters or kind of queer-coded characters in major TV shows. And I'd been writing some work around this, and I was writing it to talk about the complexity that was not really possible when we're talking about white cis het characters. White cis het characters playing queer characters, there was much more of a swap out of permitting them. And so I sort of focused on 4 of these characters. And one of my pivot points was to go, and none of them are queer. Like, all of them are not queer. And I'd just gone to writing this piece up, and I was about to submit to the editor when one of them came out. And,
Oh,
yeah. And then I left it alone for a while, kind of thought, I don't have time to rewrite this, went overseas, was doing some research overseas, came back, and I had this moment of going, oh, look, I know this other place that I can submit to. So Alternative, actually, it was the edition that Bron was putting together, and so I thought, I'll get it ready for that. I sent it and then immediately recalled it because the second actor came out.
No! Foiled again.
Then, sometime later, I was putting all of my work together, and sometimes you have work that you've worked on for a while, didn't get submitted somewhere for whatever reason. I've got a few pieces like that, and I had this piece, and I thought, well, this is ridiculous. I can work this around. I can talk about this in some way, and I kind of found a way to do it. It's losing a bit of traction for me, but I found a way to write about it. And I was genuinely, there's no word of a lie, due to submit again. And the third one came out.
No.
Yeah. So now I'm just too frightened because clearly that fourth one, the moment that I go to publish it. No, but I mean, this issue of queerness, it's interesting because I'm saying queerness, but obviously there is quite a difference between gender and sexuality. And I think when you look at something like Disclosure, a really wonderful film that talks about the issues of having someone who's cis playing somebody who's trans, and the deep problems with that are quite different to sexuality. They're quite different to that space. I'm not sure there are a million. I'm not sure that it's an all or nothing about it. I think there is some complexity to it, but it is a real concern. And I guess at the moment, with a lot of the trans exclusionary stuff too, there is a real concern over kind of setting that up as a binary problem. As well. So we're trying to know about it and talk about it a bit, but also not necessarily play it out as this is working in this way and this is working in this way. And I think one of the things that happened in 2020, and I won't mention a name with this actor that this happened with, but it was really horrible. So in 2020, there was an actor who had played a queer character on TV who came out as queer, right? And they'd played a lesbian on TV, I guess. I don't know if they were a lesbian or bisexual, but they'd played somebody who was attracted to a woman, and there was absolute support. There was across social media this incredible support and interest, and actually it was one of the people also who was the one who came out. But there was certainly a lot of interest, and I read nothing but support. There might have been a few things that weren't, but mostly it was. Then a year later, they clarified that they were non-binary, and the stuff that happened was atrocious. It was all negative. They ceased their Twitter account. They did all of this work to basically, all these people were doing all this work to basically call them out on being a liar about their gender, and also just a whole lot of transphobic stuff about their body. So the comments on the body were remarkable. And, I think that it's entirely possible that because of the scope of that, this is somebody who may not work again. I think that's possible, and I think it's appalling. And I think it needs to be called out kind of for what it is, which is not just queer phobia, but also this real problem of how we understand representation generally. And, you know, that idea that queerness is only how we regard it as queer people, you know, so it was I guess it's horrible to see any of these things as a you know, as a lesson, because this is a person's life. But it was a lesson in some of the issues around this that we needed to also have an awareness of. You know, again, sometimes people have been out at some stage, but they're no longer out. Or talking about it. And so, in that way, we've been very careful not to say that. And of course, that brings up this whole issue of queer people playing queer characters, and the power of it, I guess, is still for a lot of people undeniable because they feel it. You know, what people feel as viewers is this sense that there's a relationship to truth in playing a character, whether there is or not. And so I guess they're the things that we're interested in. But you know, our beginning point with the Indamara Winangana is to say we make a world worth living in, so we don't do damage to individual people in that way ever, you know, for the sake of, you know, research.
So, Sandy, we saw that you are part of the Center for Global Indigenous Futures.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this organization and your role in it?
Yeah, so Centre for Global Indigenous Futures is a group that comes out of a group called FIRE, which was the Forum for Indigenous Research Excellence, and it was set up by Professor Bronwyn Carlson, who's the other professor at the uni. In this continent, only about 5% of people who are academics are professors, so it's not, you know, it's a bit of a different language. So it tends to be very senior academics. And so Bron actually does a massive amount of work in the online space, writes around Indigenous online engagement, sort of remarkable body of work in that field. And she'd set this up, and she'd actually set up FIRE as a vehicle for the first ever queer Indigenous symposium that happened in 2015. So there'd never been one before that. And she brought people from all over the world simply because she had a student who was queer and Indigenous, and she wanted to have an opportunity for them to meet other people. And so Bron already knew my work, and so got me to come down and be engaged in that way. But as a result, about a year and a half ago, I started working at Macquarie, which actually hosts the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures, and that has the online journal. It's freely accessible online journal that's called Journal of Global Indigeneity. And we work with Indigenous people from around the world. So we've got a Sami journal issue that's coming out shortly. So it focuses on Sami community in the area that's now known as Norway and across that region. And we focus a lot on our relationship with people in Turtle Island. So we've got a lot of connections to people in, I guess, the modern day Canada and the modern day US. And the work that we've done is centered on a few different areas, but essentially we focus on the idea of digital lives. We focus on the locating ourselves, which is about where the queerness sits within this space, and then we do work on the idea of our futures. And so the idea of futures isn't about going. It's not really the futurism stuff about going speculative fiction, let's make the world better and then we can go and live in that. It's about the future that starts today, you know. So it's about saying how do Indigenous people make this, and how do we make it with our allies? So how do we make it with settlers and others from around the world to make these spaces that that people can grow in. And we use this idea of survivance. So it's Visner's idea, who's an Anishinaabe scholar, who talks about the idea that if we exist now, we've existed in the past, and we always will exist. So, so that when people say, "Oh, there weren't queer people decades ago, or centuries ago, or thousands of years ago," it's like, well, we exist now, so actually we did exist. That's how it is. And so it's a lot of work that does challenges to that. And a lot of work I do kind of creates those challenges. So I do a little bit of work in the museum space that's around how people gender figures of the past. So, people will gender, for instance, Venus of Willendorf is a really good example. Lots of people know Venus of Willendorf. The Willendorf figurine is this figure that's often framed as a maternal figure, as a pregnant figure, actually. And it's largely not thought of as pregnant anymore. It's now thought of as a perspective work. So it was made by somebody who was looking down at their own body. They may or may not have been pregnant. That's kind of the rendering from the last couple of centuries of how people understand. And also, I have a body that's a lot like Venus of Willendorf, and I'm not a woman. So when the character gets framed, or the figure gets framed as female or a woman, there's a challenge to it. But there's also a kind of contemporary reading that's happening when that happens. So curators are going, how I know the world is that the past just had women and men in it, and I'm just going to go through and gender them. So it does this work that's not about kind of recognizing the complexity. So what we do in the centre is that we do this kind of complex work that's around trying to make worlds better. So we work with a lot of large sites, obviously the Australian Research Council, that provides some funding to be able to do work that wouldn't otherwise be funded. But we also work with organisations like Indigitech, like Parents of Gender Diverse Children, like the Victorian government that provided the funding for that, like Facebook, who have, or Meta, who have done quite a lot of, provided quite a lot of funding for us to look at some of the issues in terms of Indigenous people online. There's a lot of myths around that. There were myths years ago that was like, Indigenous people don't use the internet, or they don't use social media. And in fact, then there were surveys done that showed that the percentage at which we used it was about 20% higher than the rest of the population, which made all the sense in the world to us, because part of what it was doing was recognizing that we were all recognizing that we needed to find a way to connect with one another, in a site where there was the capacity to do that outside of work and form community. And so Bronwyn's written quite a lot about that. But we work with Indigenous scholars from around the world. We work with Percy Lezard, who is a remarkable Two-Spirit scholar from Canada, Skills scholar, who does incredible work and actually did this report that challenged, or added to, I guess, the Murdered and Missing Women committee that had set up a real concern around how they were locating and understanding what was happening for Indigenous women and girls, and saying, look, this is happening for queer people too. Why would we be doing it separately when we know that this is affecting queer people who may also be Indigenous women and girls? And so it became also Two-Spirit on top of that. We don't have terms. We don't have a single term in this country like Two-Spirit. I mean, Two-Spirit's a relatively recent term. It's only been around for 33 years. But it's still a term that many First Nations people and Indigenous people in Turtle Island use. We don't have a similar term that works across queerness, but we would say, queer Indigenous people. And, so there is this sort of complexity that's around representation, that's around visibility in the case of social media, that's around the work that we do on recognising the horrors that can happen in our community, and also the successes that can happen in our community. In this continent, we've got this idea of closing the gap, where our our health outcomes are substantially lower than the rest of the population. Our education levels are substantially lower. A lot of the markers that are used by the white stream government are recognise that we're substantially lower. But what happens is, with the closing the gap, the idea is that we get up to here. It's never really about how we exceed the gap. It's never really about our successes. It's only about that idea of resetting disadvantage. And so part of what we do is to talk about both, to say, actually, we can talk about both. We can talk about how to make sure that people live longer lives, and we can talk about how we also thrive in the space that we're in because of our connectedness to one another. So I can't even remember what the question was. Did that answer any of it?
It did. Yeah, you got it. Sorry about that, guys. My cat. Today there were a lot of people and other animals in my room, so she's feeling neglected. And
Poor baby.
I've never seen her this active.
yeah, it's because she's feeling neglected, because there's usually no one comes in here. But anyway, so if you see fluffy tails in front of my face, that's why. She also found her toy, which is a discarded piece of plastic. Yeah, she does, but she just doesn't need it to be on camera.
She plays fetch, and it's adorable.
She does play fetch, which I did not throw her toy, so she will not fetch right now. But next question is for Hannah. Can you tell us about the Rogue 3?
Oh, Rogue 3. Gosh, you guys have done your research. Rogue 3 is an improv trio I have with two friends of mine, Brody, who plays trombone, and Ryan, who plays recorder. And we haven't been able to really do too much since the pandemic kicked off, because Ryan is based in Naarm, in Melbourne, Victoria. And so, we haven't had the chance to get together, also because Ryan and his partner have a very fresh child. And so they're busy doing that. But Rogue 3 is just, it's just a real kind of project of sounding, I guess, our relationships and also our, like, the long-term friendships that we have, and also often in place, in spaces. So like, we have one like studio recording, but we've also done recordings in a drain space in Annerley here, which is about a 15-minute bike ride from where I am right now, that goes kind of underneath the motorway. And so we played there together. We also did a recording on my parents still live where I mostly grew up, which is a small farm, a bit under 100 acres. I'm not sure if acres are the unit of measurement of, like, sort of land farm size in the US, but it's on. Okay, cool.
Yeah, Hannah, we're the ones that don't use it.
I know. Well,
we're the ones that don't use it. We use hectares.
Yeah, hectares, but that's much bigger, so it's a lot harder to measure a small farm in hectares. It's on Gayabul and Jadaware country, so southwest of a regional city called Toowoomba, and that's where I mostly grew up before I moved to Meanjin. And it's it's like got some olive trees on it. It's got some cows. It's got there's still one horse kicking around. We had a lot of horses when I was growing up. So the climate in that part, it's about a 2-hour drive from where I am now. It's not particularly far away, but that's kind of going almost directly inland. And the last couple of years, it's been the La Nina, so there's been a lot of rain, but they came into that large amount of rain from a good 9 years of quite extreme drought. And sort of towards the end of that drought time, Brody and Ryan and I did a recording out there. Really, like, there were just whole areas that didn't have any grass anymore. And it's like semi-arid country. So it's usually sort of fairly dry grasslands with quite a lot of eucalypt forest. And some of the eucalypts were dying and this kind of thing. And so this is what led into the really bad bushfire season of 2019, 2020 here. And it's not an area that usually sees bushfires. And luckily they didn't have any go through that direct area. But it was just so extremely dry and like barren in this like kind of haunting way. And so like standing on that country, and it just looks so different to when I was growing up, and now it looks so different again. And it was we called it eucalypt apocalypse. We just were like really sitting with the state of the land in that moment, and you know, the history that's contained there. I recently went up to Toowoomba a couple of weeks ago for a memorial service for actually, in a way, a kind of celebratory memorial service for what was called the Battle of One Tree Hill, or the Battle of Miwa, which is a mountain just near Toowoomba. Toowoomba's a mountain range. I mean, by mountain standards, look, I have a Canadian partner who will tell me that these are not mountains. They're just kind of big hills. But like, this is part of the Great Dividing Range. Yeah, barely mountains. They like it's still called a mountain anyway. Large hill, but a very notable one, where there was a really significant battle against the invading settlers, the colonists. And I'm going to forget the year because I'm not the greatest at my history buff, but there's a really great podcast I can recommend called Frontier War Stories with Bo Spearham, which goes into a lot more detail about this. But yeah, so I went to this memorial service that is actually for the battle that was won by the local Indigenous people, and driving people back all the way to Logan, which is about an hour and a half drive from where that mountain is. And so like a significant day's hard riding kind of thing, and so it was a really successful defeat of the settlers at that time. Of course, the crackdown that followed was extreme and led to the deaths of a lot of people. But so this was this was the 8th year, I think, of this memorial service that was honouring Aboriginal warriors in the frontier wars, which is still like part of a very unspoken truth from this area. And so
well, and it's being spoken by us more and more, and
yes,
we have
absolutely
been speaking about it for a long time. It's just that non-Indigenous people are finally recognising it. I mean, we had a lot of battles in the Wiradjuri as well, and you know what happened is it's the winning battles and losing a war is the kind of broader landscape, except we didn't lose. It's still our country. And, you know, it's not, the end war hasn't ended, you know, so there's still this notion of, the war is ongoing. And
and this Indigenous-led truth-telling.
That's really interesting.
Yeah,
it's interesting hearing you talk about that, Hannah. Sorry. How can we not that moment but the earlier moment where you're talking about the making. I didn't realise that you'd done that work out there. I don't know why I didn't, but it reminded me of, you know, Sarah Jane Moore, who's Palua, who does this remarkable work. And we used to do sound work together about 30 or so years ago. And we actually went out to Dubbo, so on my country, so on Wiradjuri country, and we recorded all of this
where I was
this work as well as music.
You know.
There you go. They're not connected, I'm hoping, but it was that same space of, you know, Australia's got a lot of droughts and a lot of floods and a lot of fires and, you know, a lot of these sort of natural disasters that aren't so natural that have happened and that are happening increasingly. But it was that moment of the kind of dryness of Dubbo that was happening might have been 32 years ago. I think we went out there, and, you know, and I was in my mid 20s at the time, probably. And it was, this really lovely connection back to country, because even when it's dry, and, that reminds me of the broader issue of representation, is that, we often don't see these landscapes played out that are unusual, or, that in the same way as we don't see a diversity of queerness, we're often not seeing a diversity of this kind of, complex rendering. I guess we see it a little bit sometimes in American shows that are shot here, because they come here. And there was this funny thing that happened during the pandemic where there were a lot of movies and TV shows that they shot here for whatever reason. People came over here and shot them. But because like 95% of our trees are gum trees or eucalypts, they'd have these, you'll see this on Netflix shows, that they have this kind of out of focus background, so you can't see it's a eucalypt while they're driving past. It's hilarious.
That said, the first time I visited LA, I was like, I had such a weird kind of experience because there's so many eucalypts. There's such a eucalypt forest, and I was like, it's like Brisbane with hummingbirds and no footpaths.
It's true. Yeah, that's right. But I mean, I guess
but this is really interesting because it also like does. It's the land, the representation of the land, but it does things to communities as well. It does things to how people behave, and when we don't see. I mean, we see these kind of romanticized representations of drought in like really particular kind of Australian television. But I don't think we see that kind of just like living with drought for a really long time and it not being like this, like, oh, this is the struggle that's going to destroy this family in the 19th century. But the kind of reality of the day-to-day life and how that kind of just subtly changes community and subtly changes the way that people live their day-to-day lives is something. And similarly with the floods, like it's not something that I think is explored in a lot of media representation, and it's really interesting.
Look, I don't think you see it much across Turtle Island either. I think you frequently, I mean, it's not just British Columbia is America. It's not just that. It's not just, shooting in particular locations to kind of make it affordable. It's more than that. It's also this idea of places like the Midwest. I mean, I did 75,000 road miles of driving when I was looking at 470 museums in the United States. So I spent a lot of time crisscrossing places in the US. And I think what I'm always surprised by when I'm in the US is how it doesn't feel like it's represented very well in in American-based shows. The people too, and that's a whole it's another conversation, but it's part of the same conversation about real representation as opposed to like the desperate. Almost like that comment that Susie Bright has in Celluloid Closet, where they say, oh, they're talking about how few lesbian films there were at the time. And, and their comment is, I think there were about 12 kind of mainstream films at the time that Celluloid Closet comes out as a movie. And it's reviewing, all of these films that have happened in the past. But they, the comment is, catching up with a friend and going, well, I saw this amazing love story between these two women and it was beautiful and they were vampires. So it's the we'll take any representation we can get, please. And and the desperation means that we don't ask for more and we don't get more actually, and people think it's enough. And who thinks it's enough is kind of what we're interested in with the Queer As audit, is understanding the power of who makes those decisions when it's this very large form work that might have queerness connected to it. You can have like a queer showrunner, but just because someone's queer doesn't necessarily mean that they understand the complexity of queerness. They understand their own queerness, and they understand what they've encountered and who they've encountered. But understanding something like Indigenous queerness, people can shy away from it. They can become concerned that they're doing the wrong thing by representing in that way, and that's intriguing. And we know that what stops that is insider voices.
Absolutely. I mean, we gotta get them in there so we can the decision making positions.
Yeah, and people are getting in there. But also, it's hard when you've still got so few people. Things don't change quickly. Even if we see much better representation than we did, it takes a long time for that representation to hit. You can have events around kind of the pushback against cis people playing trans people that happened a few years ago meant that you suddenly had a lot more trans people actually playing trans people. It did mean that, but it didn't necessarily mean that you had better representation. And, there's some really good examples of where you have otherwise beautifully constructed ideas around race, for instance. And we saw it um, with Lovecraft Country. It's got this beautiful representation in Lovecraft Country of critical race work, and then it's got the most appalling inclusion of a queer Indigenous person that is so damaging that it's terrible that they were included. It's terrible the way that they were included. They had a cis person playing the character, and somebody swap out from one continent to another continent weirdly, and the all of the other issues with it. The character was framed as two-spirit. The character was intersex. The character was and there was no discussion around that. And then spoilers, I guess, for this, they're killed immediately the moment that you meet them by another character as a kind of queer bashing, and all of this in an otherwise gorgeous work that does this. And like the complexity is still there. It's still a gorgeous work, but that's a really tricky representation to have. And I don't think any of that would have happened if they had somebody who understood queer Indigenous people.
Right.
They wouldn't have fucked up, basically. And I think the showrunner said as much.
Yeah. Totally. And
the
just
response was great.
Like, beyond like kind of, I mean, this is like vitally important, but beyond the kind of like accuracy of representation, there's another layer of complexity that's about in a way like who is the intended audience and how that has to be presented, and the kind of wrapping in which these things are presented. And so kind of I'm just thinking a bit of a scholar whose work that we both know, a friend of Sandy's as well, Prof Chelsea Wadago, a Mananjali and South Sea Islander scholar who talks about the importance of writing, like Black writing for Black audiences, like Aboriginal writing for Aboriginal audiences, and not catering constantly to this white gaze, to this settler like consumption of these things. And I think this is similarly evident in like some attempts at a complex queer identity, and the way that's rendered in television programs as this, as we were sort of saying, like siloing into these particular categories, and like it's this particular layered identity, and then and therefore this person is struggling with these particular issues in the way that they kind of work through life. And it can be quite reductive in a way that doesn't actually just like explore the complexities of a person's life and things. And I know like this is maybe harking back a little bit and forward, but this is just something I was reading this morning, and it was just so beautiful. Some writing by Kai Minosh Pyle, who's a Michif and Anishinaabe writer and a queer Indigenous person who I've like learned so much from on Twitter and in their academic work and in their writing in general. But they introduced this kind of concept of land. They just finished their PhD, which is extremely exciting, and I really look forward to reading it. But they introduced this concept of, instead of like mind-body or body-mind, of land-mind-body as a single word, and just talking in particular of this kind of like the complexity of an identity that like comes from this relationship, not only with yourself and with the other humans in the space, but with the land that you're on, and like particularly for Indigenous people, the way that relationship has like this extremely deep and like integrated connection. And like when that's not having to cater to this audience that's assumed to have no knowledge of this, when instead it's just a kind of presumption, like what possibilities are opened up there. And like, instead of having to like hold someone's hand through it. I mean, look, I also come from, this is like a very different example, but I come from this more like experimental music kind of thing was sort of that's my jam. And yeah, if you listen to any of Rogue 3, that's the kind of thing. And this kind of idea of that was so often presented when I was studying within a European art music context was like this idea of holding an audience's hand through more difficult music that's not what they would have been really familiar with because they don't know what to expect kind of thing.
Yep.
And the possibilities that are opened up when you drop that, when you actually just are the person that you are the artist that you are, and that just, you're representing the kind of life experience and just starting from this place without having to like explain all of these details. It suddenly opens up a different way of thinking representation and doing representation. And I think that is only possible, when when people from this lived experience are in the writer's room, are in the production kind of thing. So that's,
absolutely.
Just thinking this landmine body concept, like it just kind of blows open what representation is and can do for me. So yeah.
I totally for a moment there thought you were saying landmine body. I was thinking a landmine.
Oh, that could be bad.
That's right. Though I think Kai might say that too at some point.
Quite possibly.
I think, Prof Wadago with Another Day in the Colony does a whole lot of kind of giving up on the idea that places are going to get this right. And I think when we see complex identity already, we expect a little bit more. I mean, that was what happened with Lovecraft Country, right? Like you go, come on, this is a team of people who understand where we're at in terms of race. So how are you getting your depiction of another race so wrong? And the answer is that people know what they know. They have the experiences that they have and they're often grounded in that. And so part of it is about that participation in that way. And I think, that idea that you just said, Hannah, about, how do we give people things that are unusual? I mean, we think that it's really shocking and that it's difficult, or you won't have an audience if you do something that's out of the box. But we see again and again that that's not the case. Audiences actually want to have disruptions, and we're very interested in the way that people spend time with characters too. Fan fiction's a really important measure of that. People will spend so much time that they create texts that extend the characters' lives and extend the possibilities, and they write
engagement.
That's right. They're writing onto those characters in a way that is really complex, and we see that's happened in Indigenous futurisms. That while we don't really want to imagine that our futures are just this kind of beautiful world that we've made and we don't know how to get there, you can still see why there are so many Indigenous people that are interested in this notion of speculative fiction as a place to play where all of that doesn't have to be described to an audience, where an audience doesn't need to have this anchored back to them in some way because you're making worlds. And I think we saw that I keep thinking about the fact, my work is about no session. So I keep thinking about the fact that it's called a session, and obviously the challenge of sessions are they're deeply problematic. And I was really thrilled to see that it was made problematic at the end, because I think it is an incredibly important moment to recognise that these sites that we get pushed back into as Indigenous people are frequently these problematic sites. And I'm on Cubby Country right now, just north of Meanjin, which is settlers called Brisbane. And, this space is, an incredibly powerful space and has been for a long time. The space that I come from, the Wiradjuri, it's very big. It's the size of Portugal, so it's a really large country geographically. Australia landmass is about the same as the contiguous states in the US in terms of size. So it's very, big with a very small population of 25 million. But, these spaces are spaces that are really diverse. They have complexity of people as well as landscapes, as well as ways that people have engaged in the past, and everything's not about the colony. We do things in spite of the colony. I don't wake up every morning and think this is what it's like to be a colonised person. I hope, and of course sometimes we do. We've had some really horrific things that have happened just recently for us as a community, and it happens again and again. But it's important reminder that we're not front and center. Representation helps not just for us, but for the broader population. And I hate to say it, because it's like, they shouldn't have to know that we're human because we're represented in something that they care about. But we're still there. We're still at that moment in time. And we're in interim times. Things will change, but we still have to have representation. So that means it's hard to have negative representation, even though our arrival point will be having negative, like, baddies that are Indigenous characters, and baddies that are queer Indigenous characters. I don't think I've ever seen a non-binary character who's a baddie. I'd love to be proven wrong, but I don't.
I can think of an animated one, but not another one. Yeah.
There you go. But I mean, again, when I say I can't think of one, there will be some, and they'll tell a story. And the audit is about understanding what their story is, not just me going, I don't think there are any. It is actually about locating them and working out what it means when we see them.
Yeah, well, hopefully we get all the complexities, the good, the bad, the problematic, as we keep evolving in representation in media. So something to look forward to in the future. One last question for everybody before we wrap things up today. We're just curious. Sandy, this might be this is a question for you. This may be a long shot, but we have to ask. Is there some kind of Aboriginal language translation of our catchphrase, "Hydrate for lesbian Jesus"?
Well, we've got 350 languages, so the answer is no, but also the answer is, I could work on it for Wiradjuri and tell you what it might be in Wiradjuri. I'll have to come back to you, but I think it's an incredibly important question. And I'm not sure about where Jesus fits within it. Jesus might not be translatable. But in some ways, I think, Yunamara Winangana, this idea of making a world in which you get to be who you are, might be Hydrate for lesbian Jesus anyway.
Okay, yeah, I will take that. So that's even better.
And sometimes that's what happens with language. Sometimes language isn't about translation, it's about translation of ideas as well.
So. Exactly. Oh, well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Welcome. This is the only podcast I can't watch. I was here, so that's the only downside of doing it.
We have to watch our own every single time anyway, so I think you can still watch it. Is there any final words you have for our audience?
Just maybe don't discount don't discount the
No, you go, Han.
intellectual engagement or the analysis that you do just on watching day-to-day things and like having conversations about it. And it's not like some like high up here academics are doing this deep intellectual work of thinking with these shows, but like I just feel like everyone's thinking with them. And so we're trying to just kind of like articulate a bit of I guess like the idea of doing an audit is kind of like thinking across a whole lot of different things, but we're drawing a lot on the like thinking of anyone who's watching these shows and how that's kind of interacting with life. And I think everyone's doing that every time you sit down to binge watch, you're doing some intellectual labor. So I kind of wanted to throw that out there.
I think some people are doing it more than others. I think you guys are doing it more than others. But I also, sorry, I don't care if that sounds elitist. I mean, I think I think people are often looking at reproductions of the stuff that they know, and I think what's been remarkable about the work that you're doing is how much it disrupts that. And I suppose I'd say audiences want that. Years ago when I was doing the museums project, I was in the UK, and I was looking at the way that they represent their own First Nations peoples, and it was it was a very fraught, problematic kind of site, with a lot of people going, "Oh, we don't have any," it's like, you didn't just arrive, so you did. But what are you doing in terms of that? And, how are you representing this? And, there was this entire discussion around the importance of having that representation and seeing it as a kind of a through line to the past, not just random characters that pop up out of history, so not just the idea that we arrived here fully formed as queer people. We come from what we've been allowed to do, what we've been permitted to do, what we saw on TV. What we saw on TV matters if you grow up with TV, and it's got this incredible power. So we should demand more. And what we're seeing is as people demand more, they produce very eloquently? Not always, but it'll get there because there is criticism, there is kind of engagement. And so, viewer engagement, fan engagement, if you like, but it's viewer engagement more broadly matters in this space. It really does. It not just to keep shows going and to keep them, there, but also to actually keep them relevant.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very good point.
I think our listeners can resonate with that for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to talk with us today.
Yeah, it
We
was
really
amazing.
Appreciate it.
Yes.
And love getting to talk to you and know you both better.
Likewise,
same
likewise.
Here. Though it is a bit weird because I'm a bit of a fan, so it does feel like a bit of a strange situation.
Just wait. I have questions for you that we can't ask here. So
yeah, then.
Just wait.
Scared.
Yep.
I don't even know what these questions are.
No,
Me
because
neither.
I was thinking
I'm gonna
of them
hydrate.
as
I'm
we were
scared.
speaking.
Yeah.
I was thinking of them, and it's like,
We always love to tantalize our audience with things that we're going to ask off screen.
Oh yeah.
That they don't get to know.
Yeah, I can
But
imagine.
anyway.
I can imagine what some of them are. So, yeah.
Anyway, to everyone at home listening, make sure to check out the Center for Global Indigenous Futures. You can follow them on Twitter at IndigFutures. at IndigFutures. Theora made me spell it all out.
I did.
And if you're watching on YouTube, just everything will be in the description.
Lovely.
So
Thank you so much. It
Thanks
was
again.
amazing.
Bye, everyone. And with that, we've been Big Gay Energy. If you like this episode, check out all of our other episodes right here on YouTube. Please like, leave a comment below, and subscribe for more amazing and super gay content.
Until next time, stay safe and hydrate for lesbian Jesus.